Thank you, sir, again. Yes, again, it will be dealt with Ukrainian topics.
Yes. ELMIRA, ABLYALIMOVA-CHYIHOZ.
ELMIRA, ABLYALIMOVA-CHYIHOZ will have the floor.
KATERYNA BUSOLIS, GAEROS organizations, ეროვნული კონსულტანტი, გარდამავალი მართლმსაჯულებისა და კონფლიქტთან დაკავშირებული სექსუალური ძალადობის პრევენციისა და მასზე რეაგირების საკითხებზე.
Sexual violence while conflicts, how to prevent.
ამჟამად ქაბატონი კატერინა, როგორც დამოუკიდებელი მკვლევარიც წარმოდგება და
Catherine, she will present and she is going to make her speech as an independent expert.
Denis YASHNYI, KYIV-PECHERSK's
YASHNYI from Kyiv, from the Cultural Reserve. Yes, who is the leading scientific fellow of his institution.
Hello, dear colleagues.
And also the title is
თანამედროვე კოლონიზაცია, კულტურული ფასეულობები რუსეთის მიერ ოკუპირებულ ყირიმში.
Cultural values on the territories occupied by Russia. The floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to take part in the conference, and thanks to Mr. Poshevilo. My speech is continuation of the theme, but from the point of view of the activities of the Russian occupation authorities in the Crimea. The first part of our article devoted to chronology of main actions in the sphere of cultural heritage, which Russian authorities carried out in occupied Crimea. With the occupation of Crimea, the Russian Federation began two simultaneous processes in relation of the Ukrainian cultural heritage in the Autonomic Republic of Crimea and the city of Sebastopol. The first was the destruction of the Ukrainian system of cultural heritage, protection, and institutional and legislative levels. The second was appropriation, transfer, damage, or destruction of Ukrainian cultural property. On March 17, 2014, the legitimate parliament of Crimea decided to declare Crimean and independent sovereign state called the Republic of Crimea, in which Sebastopol city has a special status. Both documents proclaim the transfer of institutions that were established by Ukraine or with its participation on the territory of Crimea to state ownership of the Republic Crimea and the city of Sebastopol. On March 18, the Russian Federation and the self-proclaimed Republic of Crimea concluded the agreement, which resulted in the establishment of direct state control of the Russian Federation over the territory of Ukrainian Crimea Peninsula. The Russian government established a transitional period until January 1st, 2015, during which Crimea museums and reserve had to be registered as a Russian institution. In October 2014, a special commission in the territory of Crimea began the liquidation of Ukrainian legal cultural institution. The legitimate government of Sebastopol created new entities on the basis of the liquidated ones. The occupying authorities also declared the national preserve, Tower Khersonis, the property of the city, and deprived it of its national status. In October 2015, the government of the Russian Federation changed the status of the preserved Tower Khersonis and the National Museum of Heroic Defense and Liberation of Sevastopol to federal institution. In 2019, the National Museum of Heroic Defense and Liberation of Sevastopol was renamed to the Sebastopol Military History Museum Preserve. The entities which were created by the Russian occupying authorities on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea become the dispose of museum collection. Employees of the institution registered the museum ethos in the state catalog of the Museum Fund of the Russian Federation. At the beginning of 2020, 121,000 items from more than 1 million items kept in museum funds were returned in the catalog. The administration of museum and preserve replenishes the fund collection in 3 ways: donation, purchase, and transfer of archaeological items. The legitimate state committee for the protection of the cultural heritage of the Republic of Crimea controlled the transfer of precious metal materials from places of illegal archaeological excavation to museum funds for storage. And the heads of archaeological expeditions transferred to museum and preserve for storage 8,208 items in 2014 and other. In 2014, Russian authorities liquidated the Ukrainian state institution for the protection of immovable cultural heritage on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sebastopol, and created the State Committee for the protection of the cultural heritage of the Republic of Crimea and the Department for the Protection of Cultural Heritage Objects. The institution issued assignment and permission for the conservation of cultural heritage, and also approved project documentation for the conservation of cultural heritage sites of regional value. In June 2020, Russian authorities liquidated the State Committee for the Protection of the Cultural Heritage of the Republic of Crimea, and its functions were transferred to the Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Crimea. In 2014, the Russian Federation legally appropriated 12,612 objects of immovable cultural heritage of the national and local importance in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sebastopol. The so-called rescue archaeological excavation, which operate in places of construction of the roads, electric grids, gas pipelines, garbage processing plants, infrastructure project, and city and towns. The Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation issued more than 800 permits for archaeological excavation in the occupied Crimea in 2014-2015. More than 200 of these permits were issued for the exploration and excavation at the construction sites. In 2015, the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation permitted excavation and construction site of the high voltage line of the project, the energy bridge between the Russian Federation and Crimean Peninsula. As a result, excavation and construction works were carried out on the territory of the northern part of the archaeological heritage site necropolis of Khroni Severny. This part of the site was destroyed. The legitimate State Committee for the Protection of the Cultural Heritage of the Republic of Crimea agreed permits of the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation for the excavation, construction, and other works on sites of archaeological heritage in the construction zone of the object called Gas Main Krasnodar region, Crimea. The staff of archaeological expedition excavated 54 objects of archaeological heritage in breach of Ukrainian and international law. In 2017-2018, the Russian Federation began the reconstruction and construction of new section of the Kerch-Sebastopol highway in occupied Crimea. During this process, 94 archaeological heritage sites were destroyed during. Only 15 of these objects are present in the list of monuments of local and national importance located in the territory of Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Some destroyed objects were not included in the state register of immovable monuments of Ukraine. One of the largest projects in the city of Sebastopol is the construction of the museum and opera complex on Cape Krustalny in the conservation zone of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, ancient city of Tavrok Khersonis and its Hora. The difficulty in monitoring these facilities lies in the lack of access to necessary documentation. There is a high probability that the Saloon fortress described by 17th century Turkish travel Evliya Çelebi was located in the spot of modern Sebastopol opposite Sarı Kermen. Thank you, and my colleagues KATERYNA BUSOL, the next part presentation.
Dear colleagues, I hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much to Dennis for the introductory remarks, for the huge wealth of the introductory remarks, and I will probably continue with the boring, slightly boring legal perspective, but I will try to map it into the wider policy of the Russian Federation. From the legal perspective, the occupation of Crimea is an international armed conflict, which triggers the application of the wealth of the international treaties to which both Russia and Ukraine are parties, and which regulate the conduct of an occupying authority on the peninsula. For instance, the most specialized convention, the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in Warfare, says that an occupying power may not take unilateral actions with respect to cultural heritage, except for it's an urgent military necessity or the situation of emergency to preserve an object. So any steps concerning the relocation of the objects should obviously have the security consideration if they and should be consulted, should be agreed with the original state. If the Ukraine has not so far received such cooperation requests from Russia. The actions with respect to Ukraine's cultural heritage in Crimea have been unilaterally taken by Russia. Other more general instruments regulating the warfare, like the Geneva Convention 1949 and its additional protocols, they also prohibit the wanton destruction of property or the appropriation of property which is not justified. This applies to all types of property, and that also can apply to cultural property as a particular type of it. So there is a wealth of international legal instruments, both treaty and customary, which say that Russia is bound to consult with Ukraine on how to handle its cultural heritage, and B, that it may not take unilateral actions unless it is a situation of emergency. There is a spectrum of violations which Russia perpetrates ignoring these obligations. And the majority of the violations that have already mentioned by Dennis are first, the mass appropriation of cultural heritage. More than 4,000 state-protected Ukrainian cultural objects. This is the information of the President's Special Mission for Crimea. More than 4,000 objects have been unlawfully appropriated. There have been instrumentalized exhibitions that move the cultural heritage from Crimea, like the Ivazovsky exhibition, to be exhibited elsewhere in Russia. pursuant to Russia's curatorial narratives, which disregard the Ukrainian component, the Ukrainian flavor of those artifacts. There have been the unlawful archaeological excavations, again, not sanctioned by Ukraine, and in the course of these excavations are often connected with the development of infrastructure in Crimea, also not sanctioned by Ukraine. And also the particular case was the already mentioned Bakhchisarai Palace, the principal architectural shrine of the Crimean Tatar, the Muslim indigenous people from Crimea, and Russia conducts an unsanctioned restoration of this object, modifying its historical and cultural relevance for the history of Ukraine, for the history of Crimea, and it modifies it pursuant to its own historical narratives. And as I promised to you, I wanted to be brief with the boring legal part. Rather, I wanted to put it into a broader alleged the policy framework of Russia. And we can see two tendencies here. First, Russia really wants to adopt the history and narratives about Crimea pursuant to its all imperial and neo-imperial policy. So it does not want to show the Ukrainian layer of the peninsula. It does not want to show the Crimean, the Muslim layer of the peninsula. Instead, it shows only the Russian imprint, the dominating Russian Orthodox imprint on the peninsula. This feeds the cultural property violations into the other spectrum of violations of the persecution of the Crimean Tatars, of the persecution of Ukrainians who oppose the occupation. I would also want to stress a gendered impact of the violations against Crimean Tatar cultural heritage on the peninsula, because women who, the Crimean Tatar women, they have less places of worship to go to. Their husbands are oftentimes imprisoned for their opposition activity in Crimea, and basically they're left without breadwinners, and they're left without their shrines, and they're also left in a society where both their heritage and their opinions are considered to be extremists. So we can really speak about the gendered impact of the crimes against Ukraine's cultural heritage in Crimea. And to sum it up, I would also want to point out that it is important to see the usage of Crimea and its heritage as basically the revitalization of the colonial policy in Crimea. And it is an important point to make, because in the era where all the former empires are striving to return cultural objects to the former colonies, where they're striving to compensate the nations that were wounded through colonization or the imperial narrative, Russia is doing the opposite. And this is my main point, my main message of this presentation, that crimes against cultural heritage, they're not just about appropriation of property, they're really about the manipulation of history, and therefore they're really about the national security, a very poignant and a very important geopolitical point. Thank you very much, and I pass the floor to my colleague Elmira. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Katerina, and thank you, Denise, for your presentation. And I'm pleased to present my part of the report. And after that, I will summarize the finding of our project that named Violation of the Rules of International Humanitarian Law in Armed Conflict, Protection of Cultural Property, supported by International Renaissance Foundation. From 2017 to nowadays, we have done research of condition of cultural heritage on the territory of occupied Crimea, and Mr. Denis YASHNYI and Ms. Kateryna BUSOL, they are experts of our organization and experts of this project, and now we are working on the map of main Russians violations against cultural property in occupied Crimea, and I hope this map will be the part of virtual museum of Russian aggression that is supported by International Renaissance Foundation too. My topic is focused on the principal aspect of this project, the cultural cleansing and changing the identity of indigenous people through the destructive renovation of one of the kind remaining architectural heritage of the Crimean Tatar people, Ukrainians indigenous people, the Bakhchisarai Han Palace, as the most striking example of Russia's imperialistic policy of cultural erasure in Crimea, which shouldn't skip the international attention of international community. As you are aware, the current political context shows us that the direct destruction of cultural heritage has been capturing the attention not just of scientific community and activists, but also of major media and popular audiences. Second, the destruction of cultural heritage has become strongly associated in the public mind and in government policies with widely reviled terrorist groups. The destruction of antiquities has become sufficiently politicized to draw the eye of many groups, ranging from United Nations member states to domestic political actors, from non-governmental organizations to individual consumers of the news. But in our case, I mean in temporarily occupied territory of Crimea, we faced the situation of a completely new form of violation against the cultural heritage when, under the guise of so-called restoration, there is in fact a destruction of cultural heritage. The monuments of the complex of Bakhchisarai Han Palace certainly required restoration, but it should have been carried out with the aim of preserving its historical authenticity and the authenticity of its components and elements, with the most complete identification of its historical, architectural, and artist merits, as well as its interconnectedness with the surrounding architectural and landscape environment. But Russian authorities simply ignore the scientific work required for restoration. No field research or studies on the condition of the foundation of walls has been conducted. They have been applying ordinary construction rules to the object of huge historical and cultural value, destroying our heritage in the process. I would like to show you some photos from this so-called restoration. I hope you show this. For example, the works on the big mosque, one of the 19 monuments from complex of Bakhchisarai Han Palace. And these works were carried out using heavy construction equipment with the use of jackhammers, which led to vibrations and loss of part of the decoration of the walls. Authentic roof system, ceiling of the mosque, all are completely lost. Just a minute, these photos, and this one you can see in the left part, the condition of big mosque before restoration work, so-called restoration work, and in the right part, the condition after restoration work. Unfortunately, the works carried out by the Russian Federation are not of a restorative nature and have led to disfigurement as well as irreparable loss of authentic elements of the ancient architecture that is part of the unique complex of Bakhchisarai Han Palace, which is included in the UNESCO World Heritage Tentative List. We have fixed all these violations in our project and pass on this document to Ukrainian authorities, but this is not a story about corruption, negligence, or unprofessional actions. Bakhchisaray Han Palace carried huge symbolism for the Crimean Tatar, being the only preserved object of 3.5 centuries of statehood, an undeniable proof of the origin and development of the Crimean Tatar ethnos on the territory of Crimea, as well as a spiritual stem for the indigenous nation. The heritage object is preserved not only when it is physically preserved, but also when the people who are living in that territory retain the memory of the cultural meaning embodied in it and the awareness of its value in connection with a particular historical event. Therefore, by devaluing, even by means of rebuilding the historical significance of the object, which is the main symbol for the entire Crimean Tatar people, the occupation authorities are implementing a long-term program aimed at destroying historical memory, changing the worldview and assimilating the Crimean Tatar people in Crimea with the intention to ignore the exclusive right of the indigenous people for self-determination in Crimea. In this case, the Crimean Tatar people, who for the most part ignored the so-called referendum in 2014. So the destruction of immovable historical and cultural monuments undermines the foundations of the process of cultural inheritance, cultural continuity of the territory, erasing historical events, rewriting history for the sake of political ideology changed the cultural meanings embodied in historical events and materialized in monuments. The tragic fate of cultural heritage in the occupied territories shows that while protecting cultural monuments and historical places, it is necessary to concentrate not only combating the destruction of cultural monuments, but also on the prevention of historical falsification aimed at colonizing history and creating the needed narratives. The process also proved to need to look for the new approaches and to unite our efforts with other countries who also suffer from Russian aggressions in order to preserve cultural heritage in the occupied territory. Finally, I'd like to thank the conveners for inviting and opportunity to share the results of our project. And I'd like to thank to International Renaissance Foundation. Without their support, this project would be impossible. Thank you for your attention, and I'd like to pass the floor to convener.